Hi, everybody. I am back again with my good friend, Dr. Jawanza Eric Clark, Associate Professor of Global Christianity at Manhattan College in Riverdale, New York. Want to give you a hearty welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Courtney.
Absolutely. We're so glad that you're here. Today, we're going to be talking about Black theology. A lot of times people hear the term Black theology, but oftentimes they don't know what it means. Dr. Clark, tell us, what is Black theology?
Well, thanks, Courtney. Black theology is a form of theology or a form of theological discourse that wants to highlight the perspective of people who have been sort of marginalized or people who have been oppressed in society out of a critique that Christian theology historically has not really spoken well to the experiences of people who have been racially oppressed and even oppressed in other ways. So Black theology comes out of a legacy of struggle. It came as a product or as a result of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movements in the 50s and 60s and early 70s. And it's an attempt to speak to that experience. The other thing I would say is that Black theology is of the opinion that all theology comes from a particular perspective and location, that there is no such thing as a universal theology because human beings do theology. God is not a Christian, or God is not doing theology, right? So if human beings are doing theology, then human beings have a specific socio-historical location or a particular cultural context out of which they think and write and feel and live. And so Black theology is just trying to explain the gospel of Jesus Christ from the location of what it's like to be a Black person in America.
So now that's really interesting. How does the location of Blackness change theology? And who are some of the principal thinkers that help us to understand this?
Well, given that we live, America has historically been stratified along racial lines, and that we've had this obviously the problem of racism that's confronted us since our inception and since slavery. That unfortunately, American life has been divided along racial lines, and so then it becomes necessary to understand what role does God play and how does God speak to this? Does God support this racial division, or does God want us to overcome it? And if so, how? So when we talk about Black theology, we're really talking about a Black theology of liberation, the effort to resist structures of oppression in the name of God and in the name of Jesus, because the Black theology would say that that's what Jesus would do, right? So it's really focused on what would Jesus do in the context of America in the 20th century? Who would he be fighting for? And so it's an attempt for people like James Cone, who was one of the foremost authorities, one of the sometimes given the label of being the father of Black liberation theology. He is the first. He's not the first, but he's the most prolific in terms of his writing, starting with Black theology and Black power, and then a Black theology of liberation.
So you mentioned Jesus, and I'm interested, is Jesus the same in Black theology as he is in what we might call normative theology?
When you say the same, he is certain. Well, I would say that it depends on the Black theologian. If we're talking about James Cone, certainly James Cone has a classical Christian understanding of Jesus Christ, which is to say that James Cone views Jesus as the incarnation of God, God in the flesh. And so what's distinctive about Cone and how he understands Jesus Christ is he forces us to address the question of if it is in fact true that God made God's one and only appearance on earth in the form of Jesus, then the question is, why would God come in the form of an oppressed Jew, right? When God could have come as a king, as a priestly royal figure, God comes as a lowly, poverty-stricken carpenter. So
Mm.
he asks us to interrogate that, to think about that. What does that mean? It must mean, at least for Cone, that God identifies with the oppressed. God identifies with those who are poverty-stricken, who are struggling, who are marginalized, and who are in need of liberation, in need of salvation and redemption from their situation in life. Blessed are the poor, right? So it's an attempt to understand Blackness in relationship to the who are the most marginalized in our own day. So if Jesus identified with the most marginalized and the oppressed, then the question would be what is that group in the 20th century?
Mm-hmm.
And when we identify what that group is, then we need to marshal all our energy and effort behind them to help end their situation of suffering.
So it seems, as you stated, that the end goal is liberation and liberation of the oppressed.
Correct.
And are there particular ways that James Cone or others encourage us theologically to do this kind of liberation?
Are there ways that he encourages us theologically? Well, the first is to understand, again, if I could go back to the Blackness of Christ issue.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so let me talk about Cone a bit in the context of putting him in conversation with Albert Clegg for a moment, because Albert Clegg is another first generation Black theologian who he's actually he was a contemporary of James Cone, but a little older, and he was preaching in his church during the tumultuous time in the 60s when there were racial riots happening. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement was going on. Of course, there were peaceful demonstrations, but a lot of times those peaceful demonstrations would turn violent. And certainly after the assassination of Martin Luther King, you had more riots in response to the killing of Dr. King. And so there was a sense among the grassroots, especially of a younger generation, that the traditional forms of Christianity, many of which King himself preached, like universal love and nonviolence and turning the other cheek, that these forms of thought, these concepts weren't very effective in bringing about change in society. And so what Albert Clegg did was to preach I'll say a more militant interpretation of the gospel, which is to say that Jesus was, if we look at him historically, he was in a liberation struggle, Clegg would say, much the same as Black people in the 1960s, which is to say that the Jews at that time were being oppressed by Rome, right? Rome was the colonial authority. And in fact, crucifixion, I always tell my students, crucifixion is a form of Roman punishment, a form of capital punishment perpetuated by the Romans. It wasn't not by the Jews. The Jews didn't crucify people. So the question is, why did the Romans feel necessary to kill this man in the way that they did? Why was it important to send an example to others that you shouldn't behave as this person behaved and still be in the good graces of the Roman Empire? So he was a martyr of sorts. He was sacrificed. Cone would say he was lynched, much like many Black people who tried to resist racial oppression were lynched. And so he's trying. So Albert Clegg is saying that this gospel, this thing we call the gospel, is quite militant, is quite nationalistic, and actually Jesus is trying to lead the Jews to be liberated from Roman oppression. Now couple that with the racial configurations. He says that the Jews, if you look in the Bible and read in Exodus, we know that the Jews started out in Egypt, right? Egypt, of course, is in Africa. And so they were a people of African descent, right? Crossing the Red Sea and going into what later becomes Israel. right? So these were people of African descent, people of color. And of course, we know the Romans were coming from Europe, so they would have been, phenotypically, they would have looked white, what we would call white today. So what Albert Clegg says is that when you look at the history of what happens in Israel, in fact, you have the struggle of a Black group of people, the Jews, trying to resist a white group of people who they deemed were oppressors, the Romans. And doesn't that sound kind of familiar to what's happening in America in the 1960s? So he preached, he was very much focused on what the actors in the Bible looked like, right? And that the Jews, he would say, were Black and the Romans were white, and that mirrors what's happening in America. He's most famously known, I should say, for unveiling an image of a Black Jesus, a Black Madonna, and a Black child in 1967, for which he received a lot of death threats, had to have 24-hour security because people in America at that time, even Black people, were very uncomfortable with the idea of a Black Jesus and a Black Mary and a Black Madonna. So that's a little bit about Clegg.
Mm-hmm. Wow, you've given me so much to think about here. So there are a couple of follow-up questions that I have. The first is, how do we reconcile this racializing of the Bible with what we have typically been taught, in classical Christianity, that, Christianity is a spiritual matter, that this liberation that we're attempting to take hold of is a spiritual liberation. Do you think that the racializing of Black theology in any way compromises that spiritual message?
Well, I have two responses to that. First, I would say that liberation theology in general, beyond Clegg and even beyond Cone, that as a larger category, that is, and I'm thinking now of the Latin American liberation theologians as well, are very critical of the way in which we sort of bifurcate, or I guess we create a binary or a separation between the spiritual and the secular, or the spiritual and the political, as if these things exist in separate realms that never intersect or overlap. Mm-hmm. So even Martin Luther King was very much put off by churches, white evangelical churches in the South. In a letter from a Birmingham jail, he talks about these beautiful buildings and the fact that they preach so much about the other world, about going to heaven, and seem to ignore the problems of this world. Mm-hmm. And so what Black theology says is that the spiritual and the political are related. They intersect, they overlap, they're connected. They don't exist in separate spheres. Mm-hmm. So that's my first response. The second thing I will say in terms of your point about racializing, mm-hmm. That not all Black theologians racialize in the way that Albert Clegg does. Okay. And certainly part of what James Cone does is react against that, because Cone believes that the gospel is in fact universal. It's not nationalistic, it's not militant, it's universal. It should apply to all. Mm-hmm. But he holds on to a concept of Blackness. Mm-hmm. So you would ask, well, how do you juggle that, or how do you make that work together? Essentially, what he does is to say that Blackness is not essentially tied to skin color, right? And so he comes up with a big word that we'll call ontological Blackness. That's his fancy way of talking about symbolic Blackness, right? Not the literal Blackness that Albert Clegg was focused on, right? Pitting darker skinned people against the whiter Romans who are coming, right? For Cone, Blackness is symbolic, which means that Blackness represents the most marginalized and the oppressed, because that's who Black people in America are in the 60s were the most marginalized and oppressed. And going back again to Jesus identified in the Gospels with the poor, with the most marginalized, with the social outcasts, right? The woman with the issue of blood and others, right? Those who have been rejected by society. So what Cone is saying is he's basically equating Blackness with those who have been rejected. And
Mm,
those who have been rejected, then God identifies with those who have been rejected,
mm,
right? So for Cone, it's not just Black people, right? It's anybody who's rejected, anybody who's oppressed. And so for him, Black theology or ontological Blackness could apply to many different people in different contexts. If we would go outside of America and talk about uh, what's happening in Asian countries or in other nations, uh, it, you can be ontologically Black and not look like African Americans,
mm,
right?
mm,
And I think there's a value in that, and it's probably one of the reasons why Cone's theology has had more universal appeal, right? It has inspired people in Korea. I tell my students, there's a theology known as Mingjung theology that was inspired by Cone's understanding of Blackness and God being on the side of the oppressed. And of course, we know it was also useful in South Africa and fighting against apartheid. So, so to your point, um, other theologians like Cone wanted to move away from this racializing in the sense of focusing, honing in exclusively on skin color,
mhm,
right?
mhm.
And so he has a broader conception of what he means by Blackness and also what he means by white.
Right. So, given what you've said, in Cohn's idea of Blackness, right? Can people who identify as white be Cohn's idea of Black?
It's a good question. It actually brings us to another important term I wanted to highlight, which is solidarity.
Hmm.
So solidarity is a very important concept. Uh, Dr. King, if I could speak about him for a moment, Dr. King was very critical of white liberal Christians who he thought would support him, who supported him in theory and supported him intellectually,
Mhm.
were not willing to participate in demonstrations and actually put their bodies on the line and risk being harmed and things like that. So he talked about the problem of the white moderate. And he said that, you can't be neutral, right, in a struggle when people are locked in combat or in a struggle fighting for freedom. You're either on one side or the other. And he was encouraging white Christians, to pick up your own cross, as it were, like Jesus,
Mhm,
and be willing to suffer
mhm,
to transform America into the beloved community.
yeah.
So I mentioned him because he was articulating a notion of solidarity before that term was popular. He was talking about that Christians, if what it means to, if God is on the side of the oppressed, then it's incumbent upon the Christian to participate, to not just sympathize, but to become one with and to participate in the struggle for liberation with the oppressed. So the way James Cone says it, and he takes his insight here from Dr. King, he says that all Christians must become Black with God,
Mm,
right? And
mhm,
so obviously that's not a literal darkening of your skin.
mhm,
Obviously, what he means is being connected in spirit and then being of one mind and one heart in terms of participating in ending that suffering.
mm,
Because if we can help the least of these, the most marginalized, then all of us, right, improve. And so I think that's what he means when he says we should become Black with God. It's a very important principle. I spent a lot of time helping students to
mhm.
understand what that means. How can I become Black? Why should I even want to become Black? Why is he saying this?
Mhm.
It's a challenge.
Do you think that that requires the renunciation or the rejecting of the label of white?
Well, it will require us to talk about what it means to be white, and I think what Cone is saying is that he calls whiteness the Antichrist. What he means by that is the ideology of white supremacy is evil, is the Antichrist, and that does have to be rejected by people with white skin. But what needs to be clear, what he makes clear, and sometimes students struggle to understand this, is that this he's not condemning. In this way, he's a little different from Malcolm X. He's not condemning white people or people with white skin because as Ibram X. Kendi would say, a racist idea doesn't care who believes it, right? So you can, just because you're a white person doesn't mean you embrace whiteness. Conversely, you can have dark skin and embrace whiteness. So I think the point is to reject white identity to the extent that white identity is tied to this notion of white supremacy. If that makes sense.
It totally makes sense. My second question was, given, I mean, so I understand it's not a racialized lens, but I'm hearing a lot of white supremacy and Black experience. And so as we talked about earlier, it can be a little bit off-putting because the language makes it feel racialized. But if someone were to come, right, and to challenge you about the racialized language of Albert Klieg, or if someone were to challenge you about the racialized language that James Cone used, oftentimes when they don't understand it fully, how would you describe salvation in Black theology?
Okay. Well, I would describe salvation as very much tied to liberation. In a this worldly is based on our existential reality, or let me say that differently, it's based on our everyday situation on this planet, right? That's very much where the locus is. It's not, Black theology does not dismiss, let me be clear, does not dismiss the concept of heaven. It is not against the idea of heaven or the value in going to heaven. All it is saying is that our priority needs to be on creating a type of heaven on earth. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called it the beloved community. So he was a Baptist minister. He preached about heaven. He knew all about heaven. But how can we create a type of heaven on earth, right? And so this is what we're struggling for, because too many oppressed people have to wait until they die to, walk on streets of gold and to live that perfect existence. But they're struggling here on earth. So what I would say is, and sometimes, more traditional Orthodox Christians have a certain reaction to this, because they may say it's maybe too political, or maybe too much of a focus. But then Black theology will push back and say that classical theology is too focused on the other world and too focused on the next life, right? When this is the life we know, and this is the life we have to make the best it can be. So I would say that salvation often equals liberation, and is understood corporately in terms of fighting for the oppressed. But that does not dismiss the idea of individual salvation, that there's a notion of individual salvation and what happens in the afterlife. It just doesn't receive the focus.
So then what does Black theology do with categories like the devil and sin?
Sin, okay, so very good question. It does want to correct or critique or maybe offer a different approach to the category of sin or to the idea of sin. And one of the things it would say is that sin has been, Black theology would say traditional Christian thought has talked about sin really in only two ways. Mainly the hereditary sin, the sin that we're born with, the concept of being born in sin, right? And then personal sins, right? So even in the Catholic Church, you think about, since we teach at a Catholic institution, I always use the example to my students about the idea of the sacrament of reconciliation, where you would go to the priest and confess your sins and receive absolution, et cetera, et cetera. So I use that as an example to say that sin language in general has been very much focused on the personal, right? And individuals feeling sorry about their personal sins and, having some mechanism by which they could become cleansed of them and do penance, etc. But what is the mechanism for addressing structural sin?
Mm-hmm.
Right? You don't go to the priest and confess living in a white supremacist society or living in a patriarchy, right? That doesn't make sense. So what liberation theology does is it does not dismiss personal sins as irrelevant, but what it highlights and focuses on is structural sin that's not any one individual's fault, right? And thus it wouldn't be something that one individual could go to confess to a priest.
So kind of like structural evil.
Structural evil, right? Structural evil that is no one person's fault, but all of our responsibility to do something about. And so whether we're talking about racism or sexism, right, or even classism, when we talk about the problem of poverty and how wealth is concentrated in the hands of fewer people in this country, and all of those are structural issues, right? And it's not just about the individual being a bad person or not doing the right thing while they're in the situation that they're in. So if we could have a category where we talked about sin in more structural terms, then we could marshal our efforts to address that as much as personal individual sins.
Mm-hmm. So let's turn for a second and talk about the Black church. In this contemporary moment, how could the Black church benefit from engaging in more Black theology? And are they doing that already, or is there room for improvement?
I think there's room for improvement. Too often the Black church has always been about, well, it was born in protest, if we think historically about it, emerging from the context of slavery and especially the AME church, being founded because they were basically rejecting the racist treatment they received in the white Methodist church. So it was essentially born in protest. And so we might say that the AME church was founded in a type of Black theology, or why else did it need to be established in the first place? Why establish something distinct called African Methodist Episcopal when there's already a Methodist church, right? Right. So in that sense, it's born in protest, and it's been a long struggle since then to reconcile our situation with the society in which we live. There have been numerous struggles, and this has been a continuous struggle to address and hopefully at some point put behind us this issue of race. This issue of race hasn't gone anywhere. So the church has to constantly be confronted with that. And I think the AME church, or the Black church in general, I should say, can do a better job of embracing some of the tenets, not necessarily all the tenets, because there are, various perspectives and various Black theologians, they don't even all agree.
Right.
But I think the emphasis on finally ridding this nation of the sort of racial stain that continues to haunt it. And we certainly saw it with the last administration, with the Trump administration. So it's not like these issues have gone away. They're front and center. And I think that by studying Black theology and the various expressions of Black theology, that the church would go a long way to empowering its members to deal with some of the issues that they have to be confronted with on a daily basis.
My goodness, you are certainly a well of wisdom to draw from. I want to thank you so much for lending your expertise to this conversation. You have taught me a great deal in just this few minutes on Black theology, and even shown me some ways that I maybe even was misunderstanding it. And hopefully Dr. Clark has done that for you guys as well. We want to thank you, Dr. Clark, and we hope that you learned a tremendous amount and will begin to think about how you think through theology and aspects of Black theology in your daily lives. Until next time, talk to you soon.